The growers in Chilton County said Roy Bassett was getting about 1,200 bushels per acre off his best blocks that August. Their own best blocks were running 850, maybe 900 on a good year. The difference in money at the packing shed came out to roughly $340 per acre. Roy had 22 acres in peaches. You can do that math yourself. What you can't do is figure it out from looking at his trees, which is what the growers had been doing for 6 years, trying to find the thing that explained it. One of them finally asked him straight. Roy told him. The man drove home and told his wife that Roy Bassett had lost his mind some time back, and they just hadn't noticed. The thing Roy had been doing every November without fail since 1987 was painting his peach trees white. Not the whole tree, not the canopy, not the scaffold limbs. Just the lower trunk, from the soil line up to about knee height, brushed with standard flat white latex. The same paint a man would buy to redo his porch ceiling. He did it himself, one bucket at a time, moving through the rows in the cool November mornings before the ground got too hard. It took him 4 days to finish all 22 acres. He'd been doing it so long, he didn't think much about it anymore. It was just a thing that got done before winter. There's something about a person who doesn't have to prove anything. If you know what I mean, you'll know why this story is worth your time. Hit subscribe and stay with us. The town of Clanton sits in the middle of Chilton County, Alabama, and Chilton County is peach country the way some places are cattle country or coal country. It runs through everything. The water tower says it. The road signs say it. In a good August, the air coming off the orchards along Highway 31 is something you notice. The soil there is a sandy loam over red clay, well drained, warm enough to push Harvester and Contender and Ruston Red into decent yields most years being the qualifier. The late freezes that came through in February and March, the kind that arrived after a warm stretch, had already started pushing the trees toward bloom. Those were the years that separated the operations from each other. Those were the years a man found out what his orchard was really made of. Roy Bassett had found out in 1983. That was the year a string of warm days in late February ran the temperature up into the low 60s for almost a week. And then a cold front dropped it to 19 degrees over 2 nights. The peaches in Chilton County took a hard hit that year. Roy lost about 30% of his young trees outright. Not the fruit, the trees. And the ones that survived had bark damage on the south-facing side of the trunk that left them vulnerable to borers and disease for 2 seasons after. He lost money 3 years running from one freeze event. It was the kind of thing that makes a man think. Roy was 41 years old in 1983. He had taken over the orchard from his father, who had bought the original 12 acres in 1959 and spent 30 years building it up by adding parcels when the neighbors sold. Roy's father, Clyde, had been a steady, careful man who kept records in a ledger he maintained on the kitchen counter and who had a rule about never spending money he hadn't already earned. He'd passed the ledger to Roy when his eyesight got too bad for the work, and Roy had continued it. The ledger went back to 1962. Roy spent the winter of 1983 going through that ledger looking for patterns. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He was looking for something that would explain why some trees held through that February freeze better than others. The damaged ones and the intact ones were on the same acreage, drawing from the same water, getting the same spray program. But they weren't performing the same. Some had come through almost clean. Others had lost bark down to the cambium. He started marking which rows had held and which hadn't. He looked at variety, Contender versus Ruston Red versus Belle of Georgia. He looked at rootstock. He looked at soil drainage by row. He looked at age of tree. Nothing lined up cleanly. And then he looked at something that hadn't even occurred to him as a variable: which direction the damaged trunks were facing. South. Every one of them. South face of the trunk. Same height. Same angle. Roy had a neighbor at the time named Wiley Croft, who ran about 8 acres of peaches up the road toward Verbena, and who had come through the 1983 freeze considerably better than Roy had. Wiley was not a man who offered information without being asked. He had grown up in that county. He knew things about that ground, and he kept what he knew to himself in the way that some older farmers do, not from meanness, but from habit. You learned things by watching in Wiley's family. You didn't learn them by talking. Roy drove up to Wiley's place in January of 1984 and asked him straight what he'd done that Roy hadn't. Wiley was quiet for a moment. He was sitting on the tailgate of his Ford F-150 with a cup of coffee, watching his granddaughter work the rows with a pruning saw. He said, "Come back in November, and I'll show you." Roy came back in November. Wiley handed him a brush and a bucket of flat white latex and pointed him at a row of contender trees along the south fence. He didn't explain anything while they were working. They painted trunks for most of a morning. When they were done, Wiley said, "South face of the bark heats up in a warm January afternoon like it's March already. Temperature drops that night. Bark thinks it's been lied to. Cracks. Borers get in. That's your problem. White reflects the heat, keeps the bark temperature even. Tree stays dormant until it's actually time." Roy asked him where he'd learned that. Wiley said his father had told him. His father had learned it from a man who'd run an orchard down in Elmore County in the 1940s. A man whose name Wiley couldn't remember anymore, and Roy shouldn't worry about the name. The paint worked the same either way. Roy drove home and bought 2 gallons of flat white latex at the hardware store in Clanton. He painted every trunk on his property over the following 4 days. He did it the next November. And the November after that. By the 4th year, the habit was so ingrained he would have felt wrong skipping it, the way a man feels wrong leaving the house without checking the gate. The 1988 February freeze came in hard, 17 degrees over 3 nights, following a stretch of 60-degree days in late January that had pushed the bloom buds almost to the pink tip stage. It was a bad freeze. Chilton County took real losses across the board. Roy lost fruit on his early varieties, which was expected. What he didn't lose was bark. He walked his rows the morning after the temperature came back up, and he found 4 trees with minor south face damage. All of them in the northeast corner of Block 2, where he'd been short on paint in November and had told himself he'd finish the corner in December, and then hadn't. 4 trees out of more than 300. The unpainted corner had cost him. The rest of the orchard held. He noted it in the ledger. The entry was brief. Feb 14, 16 freeze, 17 F low. Block 2 NE corner, 4 trees minor bark split, south face. Unpainted from November. All other blocks clean. Do not skip corners. He didn't skip corners after that. What happened over the next decade wasn't dramatic. There was no moment when the county sat up and paid attention. Roy kept painting, kept recording, kept picking. His harvester trees, which he'd put in as replacements after the 1983 damage, started producing the way they were supposed to once the bark stress was removed. His contender block, 11 acres of it by the early 1990s, after he bought the petty parcel up the hill, was running yields that the county agricultural office, when they came around for their annual visits, kept noting in their reports without quite explaining. The agent who came most regularly in those years was a man named Aldridge, who had a habit of arriving with a clipboard and questions about spray programs and fertilizer rates. He spent 2 seasons asking Roy about inputs before Roy mentioned, almost in passing, the painting. Aldridge wrote it down. He came back the following spring and said he'd looked into it, and there was some literature on sunscald prevention going back to the 1970s. University trials, a few extension bulletins from other states. But it wasn't something that had gotten into the Chilton County recommendations. Roy said that was interesting. Aldridge asked if Roy had learned about it from the literature. Roy said no, he'd learned it from a neighbor who'd learned it from his father, who'd learned it from a man in Elmore County whose name was lost. Aldridge wrote that down too. Roy wasn't sure why. The growers who'd been watching Roy's yields for 6 years and trying to figure out the explanation were not, by and large, men who asked questions when they could have been asking them. Earl Pickens had been parking his truck on the shoulder of the county road that ran along Roy's south fence every August for years, watching the pickers move through the rows, making mental notes about spacing and irrigation. He'd assumed it was irrigation. He'd put in a new drip system on his own place in 1991, and his yields had improved some, but not the way Roy's had. He'd assumed it was variety selection. He'd replanted half his acreage in Contender and gotten decent results, but not what he was looking for. When he finally pulled into Roy's driveway one August morning in 1993 and asked him straight, and Roy told him about the trunks, Earl sat in his truck for a moment, not saying anything. Then, he said he'd driven past Roy's place every November for 6 years and thought Roy was painting his orchard for some reason he couldn't figure out, and had decided not to ask because it didn't seem like his business. Roy said he appreciated that. Earl said he wished he'd asked sooner. Roy said that was probably true of most things. Earl went home and bought paint. His yields the following harvest were the best he'd put up in 12 years. He told 2 other growers what Roy had told him, and they told others, and by the mid-1990s the practice had spread through about a third of the active orchards in Chilton County. Not all of them. Some men had been doing things a certain way for long enough that a bucket of white paint felt like an admission of something, and they weren't ready for that. Roy didn't push. It wasn't his place to push. He is in his early 80s now and no longer runs the physical operation himself. His daughter Renata manages it, along with a man named Curtis, who has worked the orchard since 1996, and who paints the trunks every November with the efficiency of someone who stopped thinking about why he does it about 20 years ago. The orchard runs to 31 acres now. The Contender block extended twice since Roy's time. A small block of PF Lucky 13 added along the lower slope where the drainage is best. The ledger Roy's father started in 1962 is in a fireproof box in Renata's office. Roy's entries run from 1978 to 2009, when his handwriting started to shake enough that he switched to keeping notes on index cards instead. The February 1984 entry is there. Brief, factual, exactly what Wiley Croft told him on a cold morning with a brush and a bucket of paint. Renata has read it. Curtis has read it. The county extension office has a copy, made sometime in the late 1990s when Aldridge's successor came through doing an oral history project on Chilton County growers, and Roy let them photograph the relevant pages. Every November, before the frost window opens, Renata orders 4 gallons of flat white latex from the hardware store in Clanton. Same hardware store. Same paint. The man in Elmore County whose name Wiley's father never passed along, whoever he was, whatever orchard he ran in the 1940s, whatever February freeze first made him look at his south-facing trunks and start thinking. That man's idea is still running through Chilton County peach orchards, passed hand to hand through people who mostly couldn't tell you where it started. That's how the good knowledge travels. Not through bulletins. Not through university trials, through a neighbor handing you a brush on a cold November morning and pointing you at a row of trees and saying, "Try it. You'll see."